Welcome to Woodcarving 101. Our purpose today is to give some basic information about wood carving. We're going to talk about the tools that are used, the wood, the different kinds of carving, and then finally we're going to take an in-depth look at some of the maybe 4 or 5 types of carving. So let's get right at it and let's start talking about the tools. I'm going to show you pretty much the full gamut of tools. Certainly you don't need all of these if you're just whittling, or if you're just doing chip carving. You might only need a knife. But I'm going to show you everything that would be used typically for all different types of carving. Starting out with the roughest tool, and that would be the chainsaw. And this is the one I use when I'm outside getting a log ready for large carving, or getting driftwood ready to work on. Anything that I bring inside, then I go to the electric chainsaw, and this is one that has a quarter-size tip on it, and you can get into tighter places that way. And another type of chainsaw is one that fits on an angle grinder, and this has the regular teeth of a chainsaw, and you can do some fairly detailed work that you can't do with one of the typical tin chainsaws. Then power equipment. Some people only carve with power equipment. They don't use any chisels, they don't do anything by hand, they do everything with power. And so they might use, for roughing out, a die grinder, a big machine that'll really tear some wood out in a hurry. For the more detailed work, you might go to a flexible shaft machine or to a Dremel tool, and you use different types of carbide or steel bits for that type of carving. Also in the roughing out area, I sometimes use my compressor and just an air hammer. And I had a blacksmith fix me up some chisels, and this will get rid of wood in a hurry also. Also with the compressor you can use just a little rotary tool. And of course with all of these tools I have to put on my hearing protectors and sometimes a face shield. Also, the bandsaw is an important tool for most carvers if you're roughing out your own carvings. The most used tool, at least for me, is what is behind me here, and that is all of the chisels and mallet that I use. Probably 90 or 95% of the carving I do would be with this. And of those types of carvings that I named, these are the tools that are basically used. The chisels are named by the sweep. In other words, how much curve they have to them. All of the gouges or sweeps would start with a number 1, which is flat. This is a number 2, and as you can see, it has just a very, very slight curve to it. Go all the way up to a number 11 sweep, and as you can see, this one is a big U-shaped, and it's for more detail. Everything that you see in this center section are sweeps from 1 to 11, and why do I have so many? It's just because you need narrow ones, you need wide ones, and depending on what you're doing with the carving. Then there are specialty tools that are used. For instance, V-chisel is a very important chisel, and it is, just like it says, it's a V-shaped shape, and used extensively in carving. Another type of sweep are those that are in this panel here. These are all bent chisels. This one is called a spoon bit, and it's obvious why it's called that, as opposed to one that has a long sweep, and this one would be just called a bent chisel. And the third type that's in here is a back bend. And this might be a little hard to see, but the bend actually goes the other way like this. And it's to get into very, very tight places that you can't get into with a spoon bit or a long bend. Finally, with all of these chisels, if you're doing rough work, you're going to need a mallet. And if you're doing fine work, then you usually just hold the chisel with two hands, and I'm going to show you in a minute what I mean by that. But the last tool I want to talk about are the knives. As I said earlier, some people only use knives. I'm going to show you some carvings in a few minutes that I did just with this pocket knife. Before I learned to carve, before I had any chisels or mallets or any of these other tools, I just used this pocket knife, and I'm going to show you some of the carvings that I made with it. So if you're interested in carving, it can be as simple as just a pocket knife. Some forms of the pocket knife: a long sharp point, one with just a little bit different curve, another one that would be called a chip carving knife, and finally a crooked knife. And these kind of come from the Northwest Coast Indians, who used crooked knives in carving their totem poles. But they're very handy because there's a left and a right, and you can get into some tight spots that you can't get with a regular knife. I'd like to demonstrate some proper techniques so that we can do this carving safely. When you're using a chisel and mallet, you could easily, if it's going to go through the wood, it's going to go through your skin and bone much easier. So it's real safe to use a chisel and mallet because you've got both hands occupied, and there's no way I can get my hands in the line of this carving with this knife, this chisel, if I'm carving away from myself and I have one hand on each. If I'm carving sideways, even if I'm carving towards me, I have control, and I can do this in a safe manner. So one hand on the chisel, one hand on the mallet, safe way to carve. But sometimes you need to have more control, and so you would just use two hands on the chisel. And several ways to do that. You can put your hand this way, or you can put your hand this way. And depending on the detail and how fine a detail, I use both methods. So if I'm trying to take some wood off, you can see with a sharp chisel, I can pick a lot of wood quickly without a mallet. If I want to do detail, and I can go a little slower and clean up an area. But again, safe, no way I can cut myself. I do cut myself with these chisels, but it's only because I reach over to my bench. I look at a chisel and I reach over for it, and don't watch my hand all the way there, and I'll just touch the tip of it with my finger, and they're so sharp that they're going to cut you quickly. When using a knife, for me, I can do it safely because I almost always use two hands on the knife. I have my wood supported and held, and if I were working on an eye, for instance, I'm going to have both hands on the knife to control it. So I can make my cuts. And I have the beginnings of an eye. Kinds of wood. In a nutshell, for carving you can use any kind. Any kind that can be carved, not all of them as easy as others. I probably carved most of the hardwoods in Tennessee. The preferred wood, the one used most often, would be basswood. It's locally available, although this is the southern range for basswood, but you can find basswood in Tennessee. Butternut is a wonderful carving wood. Party would be considered second. And then you get into others that you just find. For instance, cedar, beautiful wood, but it splits easily. All of them have their characteristics. Catalpa is an excellent carving wood. Yellow poplar, buckeye, tupelo, many other types. For me, I carve a lot of driftwood, so anything that I find that is solid and has a nice color, I carve it. Let's talk now about the different types of carving. The simplest and cheapest is whittling, just with a knife. And here are some examples of some pieces that were whittled basically with a knife. Starting with the very simplest, you can go out and cut a twig off a tree, a live twig. You need a live twig for this in order to get the curls, and you're going to end up with a little rooster like this from this twig. So as simple as that, you can, probably 15-20 minutes of carving. The little skunk is just simply carved with a knife. The shoe, the two mice. The bird is a real simple bird carving. And then we get a little bit more complicated when we get to the donkey, and he's got all kinds of the prospector's tools on his back. And then probably the most complicated one is the one you see right here, the bobcat. And that, it was done with a knife and a wood burner. But all of these basically can be done with just a jackknife. Another type of carving is caricature carving. You might think of them as cartoon type characters, and this is where we exaggerate features. So these would be examples of, you can make a long, narrow face, a very heavy face, short legs, long legs, caricature carving. Animal carving. There are some people who only carve fish. Some people only carve birds. And some people carve all kinds of animals. Relief carving. This is an example that came from Cambodia. And I measured this piece of wood. It is less than 3/4 of an inch thick, but look at the detail they can get. This is called relief carving, and you can get all kinds of perspective and depth in a very shallow space if you know the right techniques to use. Abstract or stylized carving. This would be an example of a stylized carving where I take a piece of driftwood, and it's a beautiful piece of cedar, and when I got into it, it had a beautiful grain and figure to it. And so I carve part of the fish and I leave the rest to your imagination. That would be a stylized type of carving. Full figure carving, that would be the whole body or a bust, and done in a realistic manner. So you would want it to look exactly, or as close as you can make it, exactly to the real life form. We'll look at it in more detail of full figures in a minute. Miniature carving, that has real close requirements. For instance, everything is carved inside or with a 2-inch cube. And there are people that do some fantastic carvings with tremendous detail just in a small 2 by 2 by 2 cube of wood. Architectural carving is another field, and we're all familiar with Victorian gingerbread. Churches that have ornate carvings would all be in the field of architectural carving. And finally, chainsaw carving. The chainsaw carving can be quite crude and it can be quite well done, and I think I have an example here of a chainsaw artist who did a real nice job on a bear. This is not my work, this is somebody else's, but I think it's very well done. All of it was done with the chainsaw except around the nose and the eyes. The eyes are marbles. The rest is all just done with a chainsaw. Probably my favorite type of carving is called found wood. It's fun for me because I start out with an interesting piece of wood, and then you see what you can find in that wood. So I have some examples. Let's take a pine knot. This is a huge pine knot, came from Oregon. What can you do with it? Well, to me, I see a hat brim here, and this is a hat, and we'll put a face down here. So we end up with an example of a face carved in a pine knot. Cottonwood bark, another found wood. When the cottonwood tree dies, the bark, often growing very thick, especially in the northern states, and makes a wonderful carving wood. With it, you can carve a face, and here I've carved an Anasazi Indian, and down below the cliff houses that he might have lived in. This is a piece of cottonwood bark that I found locally, and that's about as thick as you find it in Tennessee, and with it I made a little whimsical house where the back is hollowed out and you can see through the windows. Cypress knees. What can you do with those? Well, you can do all kinds of things. So here's one example of a face, and I've wood burned his hair and mustache and beard. Driftwood. What can you do with a piece like this? Boy, to me, that's too nice to throw away. It's such an interesting shape. Should be able to find something you can do with it. Here would be an example, something like this, where it's real thin, and I didn't have enough room to really carve much depth in the face, so I ended up making masks. So the eyes are pierced through, and you just let the interesting shape of the wood be part of the carving. Just a hunk of log can turn into a bust. And here we have two examples of Indian busts that were just carved out of a chunk of log. What can you do with the branches? See this branch? It can turn into a hat. And I call these hat men. And finally, another piece of driftwood. Let's turn this one sideways, and to me, when I look at this, I see, all right, I think I could see a bird flying, and these are his two wings. And perhaps down here, this is a wing, and this would be the tail feathers, and this might turn into two birds flying in that direction. Here's another piece of driftwood, kind of the same idea, where the two of the branches of the root became the wings of the bird. So to me, found wood is a wonderful medium to work with, and I really enjoy working with it. For me, the most complex kind of carving is what is called full figure carving. This is a realistic presentation of the human form, and so my task is to show some movement, to have it be realistic, so it doesn't look like something's wrong. If you've ever looked at a carving or a statue or a picture when something just doesn't look right, it's probably because there's some proportion that isn't right. So my goal is to get those proportions correct. For example, if we measured this figure out, if we eliminated the beard, from the top of the head to the bottom of the beard is the length of the face. And we can determine most of the rest of the proportions of this body from the length of the face. The length of the face is also the width or depth of the face, not the width, the depth. The width of the face, the distance across here, is 3/4 of its length. The distance from the chin to the nipples is 1 head length. The distance from the nipples to the waist is 1 head length. From the waist to the crotch is 1 head length. 2 head lengths to the knees, and 2 head lengths to the bottom of the feet. So with just those facts, you can take a figure and it's considered an 8-head figure. People will vary anywhere between 7.5 or 7 and 8 heads, most people. Oftentimes in pictures of models showing clothes and that sort of thing, they'll make it 10 heads high, and they add all those extra 2 lengths or 2 head lengths to the legs to make them long-legged. Some of the Greek statues, when I look at them, their heads are too small. And the reason is, it's a 10-head figure. And they'd add those extra length to the legs. But this is basically an 8-head carving. Other things you have to keep in mind on proportion. The length from the top of the shoulder to the elbow is the same as from the elbow to this first knuckle on the hand. So this distance and this distance should be the same. The distance across the shoulders is 2 heads. Of course, the waist depends on how much food you eat. The length of the foot is 1 head. The length of the hand is 1 head. All of these are basic principles that you use when you start thinking about a full figure. And when you start out with a log, as I did on this piece, it becomes quite a task, at least for me, when I start cutting away wood, is I can't cut away too much. I have to cut away a little, take a look at it, measure it, and I do a lot of measuring with this type of carving. I want to show 2 other examples of full figure carving. Another challenge of doing full figure carvings out of a log is that you're going to have differences in drying. The outside will dry faster than the inside, so you're going to get checks and cracks. I use just slivers of the wood to fill those cracks. This one had a number of them. You probably would have to search to find them. The other problem with full figure carvings is they ought to be seen from all directions. So you can see the back of this has a feathered headdress. There are 2 things that are added to this. This hatchet or tomahawk The knife is a piece of antler that I've carved a wolf head in. The shield is actually part of